Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Peatland Perspectives Greenhouse Gas Emissions Workshops. We can see that some of you are still joining, but we will start because we already have quite a few of you. So I will hand over to Birger Kerko for the opening remarks and practical issues. So off you go, Birger.
Okay. Thank you, Lena. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Agency of Renewable Resources, FNR, I would like to welcome you to the online workshop Peatland Perspectives Greenhouse Gas Emissions. My name is Birger Kerko and I'm heading the Department for European and International Cooperation. Globally, peatlands store and sequester more carbon than all the world's forests combined, even though they cover only 3% of the Earth's land area. This is why peatlands are part of the German government's climate action program. The German Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture, via FNR, has been extensively funding projects in the field of peatland protection and peat use reduction since 2021. On behalf of the Ministry, FNR is organizing a series of workshops focusing on the agricultural or forestry use of wet peatlands, namely paludiculture. With the launch of the online workshop series Peatland Perspectives, Paludiculture and Climate Change Mitigation, we want to promote international dialogue on peatland protection in Europe. The focus will be on paludiculture, greenhouse gas emissions, and the circular bioeconomy. Today is the second event of the Peatland Perspectives online workshop series. We are delighted to welcome back so many of you. The final workshop of the series will take place on 17th of October this year. We hope to see you there as well. Today's workshop will focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions of peatlands. Firstly, we will also take a closer look at the methodology used to measure these emissions, followed by presentations on the findings of research projects in Germany, Finland, and Lithuania. To conclude the workshop, we will have a discussion amongst all speakers presenting today. Already now, I would like to thank all the speakers for their contributions and you, dear participants, for attending the workshop. Finally, a few words on practical issues. Please enter your questions into the chat. We encourage you to use the chat as a tool to exchange information with other participants. The event will be recorded, so we can rewatch specific sections later on. I'm looking forward to fruitful discussions and new perspectives for everyone. I will now hand over to Ms. Lena Hook again, who will guide you through this workshop. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Birger. So yes, I will introduce myself. My name is Lena Hook. I also work at the Agency for Renewable Resources in the Department for EU and International Affairs, and I am the one who has been sending all the emails and basically organizing this event. So I'm very happy that the day is finally here to see all of you, and I really look forward to this workshop. And next to me is my colleague Wiebke Baumgarten, and she will moderate the discussion that we will have in the afternoon. Yes, so really warm welcome to all of you, and we will now, and yes, just a disclaimer once again, what Birger said before, please really use the chat to also discuss. It is a bit difficult. Currently, we have over 60 participants that all of you chat together. So the chat is really the place where you can ask questions, share information, and discuss amongst yourself, because everyone who is joining here in this workshop is able to read it. And if you have any questions to us specifically, just send a message to FNR EU and we will receive anything. So just to make sure you are aware of this. But yeah, then we will get into the first presentation by Bärbel Thiermeier from the Johann Heinrich von Thun Institute, or TI, from Germany, and she will have a presentation on measuring greenhouse gas emissions of peatland. So just give me a second to find the presentation, and Frau Thiermeier, please, let's
through it. So good morning,
yes,
everyone.
Flexible.
Welcome to my small lecture on measuring greenhouse gas emissions from peatlands. I will try to go through both chamber and eddy covariance measurements for all three major gases within 20 minutes, which is quite a bit of a challenge. Well, as a first start, why measure at all? Don't we know enough about greenhouse gas emissions from peatlands? First of all, there might be always surprises, results that we didn't expect, especially if we have novel systems such as subsurface irrigation or paludicultures. And paludicultures are definitely novel systems which we haven't studied before. And second thing is that there have been technical improvements, for example, portable methane analyzers, which really improves our understanding of the systems and also, of course, the measurement results. So there is still need to measure greenhouse gases from novel systems such as paludicultures. And I will start with a brief theoretical framework on the greenhouse gas balances and also the carbon balances of soils. And soils is an important thing here because this is what we want to know. We want to know how much carbon stays in the soil, whether there's an uptake of carbon or whether we lose carbon from the soils or from the peats. And another important thing is when we look at figures later, is a sign convention. So I'm using the atmospheric sign convention here. So everything which goes from the atmosphere into the ecosystem is negative, and positively it's what we are losing to the atmosphere. So let's start. First of all, we have plants, ideally paludiculture plants such as typha, and they of course do photosynthesis and take up carbon. And they respire a bit of it again as autotrophic respiration. The difference between the two is the net primary production. Usually we don't measure directly the GPP, also you can do it on a leaf level. As a second step, we have, of course, the input in agricultural systems of organic fertilizers, and more importantly, the harvest of the biomass, if we don't talk about natural systems. And this is extremely important. It's, of course, important to define your system boundaries. So we are really talking about what the soil is losing or gaining, and not doing any product or production chain greenhouse gas balances. And also carbon in non-peat forming plants is a very, very short-term pool. There are always misconceptions around about carbon being bound in the short-lived harvest products, especially of agricultural products. If we talk about long-lived products like wood or paludi biomass potentially, then it might enter long-lived pools, but still this is another system boundary than the soil. So extremely important issue here. Then, of course, we have microorganisms. Microorganisms respire peat, but they also may respire from litter. That's the so-called heterotrophic respiration. But we can't measure it very well separately from the autotrophic respiration from the plants. There are methods like trenching, but they have their methodological issues. So usually the ecosystem respiration is measured together. So autotrophic and heterotrophic respiration is measured together mainly by chambers. So we need to remember also this term ecosystem respiration. And if we look at the scheme, we can see define the net ecosystem exchange, which is a sum of GPP and ecosystem respiration. GPP being negative here because it's an uptake from the atmosphere. This is also very important to remember. This is the basic parts, but there might be other ways how we lose carbon from the system. First of all, there is export of dissolved organic carbon and also inorganic carbon compounds. This is the stuff which colors the water of peatlands like tea or other greenish or yellow colors, and especially in more wet systems, this might be really an important component of the whole carbon balance. Um, we have, of course, methane, which enters here the balance as such as carbon, not with its global warming potential, but it's also a loss of carbon from the system. And we might also, depending on the system, have fire erosion going on, leading to the export of particulate carbon and peat extraction. I won't focus on these parts in this talk because it really depends on the system and requires completely different methods to measure these components. But there are, of course, losses of carbon from the soil. If we add up all of this, we can derive a carbon balance of the soil. This is what we want to know, but we are not there if we want to have the greenhouse gas balance of the soil. First, we have to subtract the methane as carbon again and convert the carbon change to CO2. And then we need to know nitrous oxide and methane emissions, which can be measured both with chambers and eddy covariance, which I will talk about later, and multiply them with the actual global warming potentials. This is a straightforward method. There are also other approaches to enter the different greenhouse gases according to their radiative forcing potential. But for now, we use the global warming potentials and have our greenhouse gas balance. So this is already rather complex, but we will go now and how to measure the most important components of the greenhouse gas balance. So first of all, here we have the simplified equation. So it's just carbon dioxide as net ecosystem exchange, methane, nitrous oxide, the export by harvest, the import by organic fertilizers, and also dissolved organic carbon. What can we do? First of all, the most important component in most systems is carbon dioxide. And we have basically two approaches to use eddy covariance or manual chambers in combination with portable field analyzers, which are able to record the CO2 concentrations in a high temporal resolution. We could use also automatic chambers. There are very sophisticated approaches. Maybe Matthias Drösler will talk about them later, but I won't go into detail in this presentation. Methane can be also measured by eddy covariance. There's not so much data around, and by different chamber approaches. Back in the days, mostly vial and gas chromatographic analysis have been used for this. This has some shortcomings, but nowadays more and more portable field analyzers are used for methane as well, which really improves the quality of our data. For nitrous oxide, eddy covariance is theoretically possible, but very expensive and requires a really, really high level of knowledge, and also manual and automatic chambers, usually vials and gas chromatographic analyzers. Portable analyzers will be coming, I guess, within the next years. Then we have the harvest. We need to sample it and analyze it to know how much carbon is leaving the system. This is straightforward for manual chambers, more complex for eddy covariance. We have the import, so we need to know the carbon content of the analyzer and also amount of analyzer if we have, for example, grassland systems. And for quantifying dissolved organic carbon exports, we need the discharge and concentration measurements. And depending on the system, this can be really complex and would require a talk on its own. But coming back to the NEE measurements of CO2, basically, as I said, there are two approaches using transparent chambers with portable analyzers and the micrometrological method. It might, no, it's one slide before. So we measure when we use the chambers. I apologize, this is still in German. The ecosystem respiration with non-transparent chamber and the non-net ecosystem exchange with transparent chambers. We record the concentrations in the field, which increase, of course, for ecosystem respiration because photosynthesis is excluded with the non-transparent chambers, and the net ecosystem exchange with transparent chambers. Depending on the system, this curve might go up or down, depending on whether the photosynthesis or the microbes win. And we can, by different approaches, calculate the gross primary production as a difference between the two of those. And I brought a small video. I hope it works, how it might look in the field. So here we have non-transparent chambers, very large ones to be applicable to Taifa cultures. And they move from plot to plot, measuring only a few minutes and cover the whole diurnal cycle. So start before sunrise at low soil temperatures and low radiation, and continue running around with his chambers, repeating measurements at each plot for the whole day until maximum sunlight conditions and maximum soil temperature is reached. We need this data then to parameterize functional relationships. Usually, the respiration is parameterized according to the Lloyd and Taylor function, but other approaches are also possible. The respiration mainly depends on soil temperature, but also because, remember, it's heterotrophic and autotrophic respiration on the development stage of the plant. So in an ideal case, one such daily campaign may end up with, for this time of the year, a relationship like this. Then for the GPP, of course, it depends also on the development stage of the plants, but mainly on the radiation. So on a nice summer day, the GPP response function might look like this. And of course, in the end, we are interested in how a daily, in an annual balance. So we do these measurements all 3 weeks in the vegetation period, considering harvest events and such, and use this functional relationship to build with continuously measured half-hourly data on radiation and temperature, build annual balances, taking into account the uncertainty of this response functions. And in this case, it might look like this over 2 years. And you see a GPP is increasing in summer. There are no abrupt changes, so no harvests in the system. Also, ecosystem respiration, of course, is higher with warmer temperatures, and the NEE is somewhere in between, changing between sink or source, and probably in this system ending up being a source in the cooler year 2017 and being a sink in the cooler year 2017 and a source in the year 2018. This is about CO2 only. Theoretically, similar approaches are possibly with portable analyzers for methane, but this is still under development. The other approach is the eddy covariance method. Eddy is not a person, but these little movements or eddies of the air. And with this method, you capture both the wind direction, the wind speed with all its 3 components, and the gas concentrations of the gas of interest in a very high temporal resolution, like 10 Hertz. And you can, from this, derive the exchange between the biosphere and the atmosphere. This has advantages, so you don't have to put on chambers. The temporal resolution is much higher, but it also has quite a challenge because wind direction and speed, of course, change over the course of the year and also over the course of the day. So the source area from where your signal is coming changes quite a bit temporarily, so you need a theoretically homogeneous area with the same crop, the same water level, the same plants, without any tree lines and so on, to get good data. That might be in some environments quite challenging, and it also raises issues in what is the water level or what is the carbon export in the footprint of your system. But it has, of course, big advantages, especially with taller vegetation, which might suffer over long-term observation records from the chambers. So for long-term observations, covariance is definitely a method of choice. I will also have some time now to talk about chamber-based N2O and methane measurements, which might look like this, where you place chambers, take vials with gases to the laboratory, look at the concentration increase or decrease, and calculate your fluxes and your annual balances from it. This is a very schematic figure. In reality, there's lots of discussion on linearity versus non-linearity, on outlier detection and other issues. So we will look at it briefly later on, but first I will talk for two slides on portable analyzers. Why are they so important, or why is also eddy covariance important? Well, look at where the methane is coming from. And methane is definitely an issue for wet peatlands and also for paludic crops such as Typher or Phragmites. The thing which you can capture well is methane production by diffusion, but there might be also ebullition and plant-mediated transport through the parenchyma of the plants. The parenchyma is what makes plants like Typha the ideal building material for insulation and such, but it's also a gas transport channel. And this might depend, depending on the plant, also on photosynthesis, pressure, humidity, and all the stuff which you exclude when using non-transparent chambers, and which also might change within the course of the day. So portable analyzers or eddy covariance will definitely improve our understanding what is happening with the methane out there. And also an issue is, especially if you have storage polders for water or other open water bodies, how to measure an open water. This is really also quite complicated because there's waves and stuff, and also the area is, well, difficult to define. Eddy covariance might be an issue, a method, but not all water bodies are large enough. So here, portable analyzers are potentially also much more reliable than the traditional method using vials and gas chromatography. So with the chambers, is it just about putting a bucket onto the soil, or like here on the water? Well, there's much more about it when you want to have some data with really good quality. You have to think about things and also invest some time and potentially money. First of all, the number of replicates and temporal resolution, especially if you have fertilized systems, you can have short-lived, very high nitrous oxides peak. So it's not a good idea to measure only once in a month in a fertilized system. And there are lots of things like pressure equalization, temperature measurement and control, especially with transparent chamber, using fans, but how many and how strong, gas tight connections, and also using boardwalks. I would never trust a measurement with chambers from peatlands if there wasn't a solid boardwalk because of artifacts caused by the person conducting the measurements. There's lots of guidelines out there, there's lots of discussion, which I don't have the time to go into detail, but it's not about just a bucket. Then there's a flux calculation, ideally with standardized scripts, including outlier detection, linear versus non-linearity, to be not that subjective. And the last thing I want to briefly talk about is any gas flux measurement is only as good as the explanatory variables. As long as we don't know anything about soils, hydrology, vegetation, we can have perfect gas measurements and will not make any useful sense of it. So it's not only water level. Water level can be difficult to measure, to be measured on its own, but as you can see from this curve, the scatter around water table and CO2 emissions is quite large. And so we can think about other variables. It's not mean water level, but also the distribution. We can think about soil moisture, which is also quite difficult to measure in organic soils. We can think of soil physical properties, which of course determine the relationship between soil moisture and water level. We can think of the carbon and nitrogen stocks, and of course on the nutrient supply, which is kind of a pet topic of mine, because this definitely influences what the microorganisms are doing, and which will become, of course, important for plant growth as well in paludicultures. Nitrate in the soil solution is extremely important for nitrous oxide fluxes, for example. We have different peat types. Peat is not peat, as you're probably all aware of. They have different contents of labile organic matter, microbial communities, and such. And finally, there's vegetation, hopefully. And it is well known, as I mentioned, that the cover or leaf area index of parenchymus plants is important to explain methane emissions. So there's really lots of stuff which need to be known to understand flux data, and also finally to manage peatlands better and to build better models to predict what the emissions of a system we don't have data from will be. So to conclude, or to summarize, I tried a summary, what can be used where. So plot scale experiments with treatments, it's only useful with chambers. If we go for field scale experiments, large scale vegetation, it's eddy covariance, which has also the best temporal resolution. So sometimes it's a trade-off between spatial resolution and temporal resolution. Carbon dioxide is possible with chamber and portable analyzer and eddy covariance, but never try to use GC data. The chamber closures are much, much too long to get any useful results from it. Methane theoretically possible with everything. Nitrous oxide portable analyzers are not peatland ready. And of course, the level of expertise, costs, and so on shifts from eddy covariance to chambers, from more costs for instruments to lower costs in the field, to the opposite for the chambers. And I think, I nearly run out of time. So I would like to thank you for the invitation, and also all funding agencies from which I drew the exemplary figures from, and everyone, of course, who helped in the field, who allowed us access to fields, and so on. So I will end the presentation now. You are probably ready for a coffee already now. I apologize for that. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this very comprehensive presentations of all the different methods. I see lots of claps with the hands. That is lovely. So we can see that you really appreciated this very informative presentation. Thank you very much. Even more, yes, fantastic. Then if you, like I already wrote in the chat, if you have any questions specifically to this presentation, please write it in the chat. If you think of something later, don't worry, you can still write it, and then we will have some time in the discussion if you can't think of anything right now. I think this just shows that this presentation was very clear, informative, and also very interesting. So I don't think that anyone needs a coffee straight away, and a nice use also with the video to see how these things are used in action. But yeah, I still don't see any questions. Then we will just move to the next presentation. And if you think of anything, just use the chat. So thank you very much. And we will move on to the next presentation. And our speaker is already visible. Fantastic. It's Matthias Drössler from the Peatland Science Center at the University of Applied Sciences of Weinstefan-Triesdorf here in Germany. And I will show the presentation and then we can start. Just a second. Okay, presentation is looking good. Then the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Mrs. Hook, for the administration and the facilities here, as well to FNR for the opportunity to give that talk. And welcome to everybody who is listening and hearing maybe what we want to transmit. So the project, I'm giving some results, was coordinated by Tim Eikenscheid. He is at the moment at the the German Soil Association at the meeting. So I give that talk, and so Carla Bockermann did her PhD within. A lot of the results I show is coming from these two guys, and with a lot of support of my big team in the Peatland Science Center. Next slide, please. So I have structured my talk a bit with questions. What is the More Use project? How to establish polycultures? What is the climatic relevance? Which utilization options are available? What is the economic efficiency? And finally, what has to be studied further? Next. So the More Use project. This is paludiculture on fen peatlands in Bavaria. We started in 2015 to think about what is needed for the future for the peatlands, and had the opportunity to be funded by the German Environmental Ministry and the EFRI program from the European Union. And it was great to see that in that time we already had some, I think, breaking ideas in guiding the fen peatlands towards climate-friendly way of land use as well, together with economic viability. Next, please. So you cannot do that alone. There's a big team of researchers within the university and outside of the university, and you see how many institutions are involved to support that project. Next, please. So the core, let's say, drawing is coming in several of the slides again, and that's the structure of the project. So we had a module 1 where we said wanted to study about the plant establishment, the module 2 about the climate impact and environmental effects, module 3 the utilization potentials, and the module 4 is about economics, regional and super-regional usages. So this is the structure of the project, and I go through with my questions through these different modules and give something about the different results which we have already. Next, please. So that's the second question. No, go back, please, to the questions. So how to establish paludiculture? That's about this module 1. So next slide. And here in that module 1, our idea was to use the plants so as paludicultures which were originally building up the fen peatland, so and make use of them. But the big question was how to get to a positive result in establishing these plants. The plants are Typha, broadleaf cattail, Typha latifolia, the narrowleaf cattail, Typha angustifolia, the common reed, Phragmites australis, reed canary grass, Phalaris arundinacea, lesser pond sedge, Carex acutiformis, and slim sedge, the Carex acuta. So these 6 plant species were tested, and we developed a lot of trials how to best be able to establish them in the field. And the major 2 differences were we tested sowing and planting, and we can already say that all plants, but not the sedges, are able to be sown, but with the sedges at the moment, we have the impression that it's better to plant them. Next slide. We developed, and mainly Tim Eichenscheid developed a guideline for the establishment of the Fen paludicultures. It's available at ResearchGate. You can download it, and there's a lot of information how to prepare the site, what is the sowing timing, what is the depth, how many seeds you need per hectare, and so on. So I recommend you to download it and use it, because that's at the moment the state of the art, what we know about the establishment of paludicultures. Next slide. So then the second part was module 2, what is the climatic relevance? And I'm very happy that Bärbel Thiemeyer did a lot of background information, which I just can omit now, and show you what are the results once you really do these measurements on the paludicultures. And Bärbel said quite correct that we need measurements on newly established land use types, and paludicultures are really new, and we don't know too much about them. With our project, we know a bit now, specifically for the southern German conditions. Next slide. So, but allow me to remind you maybe that the basis for all of that was already 25 years ago, when I developed the chamber technology, and all these approaches which Bärbel showed were set up in my master thesis, basically on the chamber techniques. Next slide. We have long traditions in the Peatland Science Center about these measurements since 1999, covering almost all land use types on Bavarian peatlands. So Bavaria is the southern part of Germany. Manual chambers, eddy covariance, automated chambers, more than 160 site years with complete CO2 and methane and nitrous oxide balances, including ancillary data. And that was Bärbel said before, it's extremely important to have these ancillary data, climate parameters, water table, soil, and so on, which help you to interpret the fluxes in a way so that you can really put them to the models. Next slide. So now let's go to the module 2. In fact, from the MOUSE project, you see here the setup, the field setup to determine mitigation potentials of paludicultures. We had 3 sites in southern Germany on different fen peatlands, formerly drained for cropland or grassland, 5 paludiculture plants with different management for reed canary grass. There was a rewetting going on with active pumping or blocking drainage, and the water table is constant or fluctuating spanning in the mean annual groundwater table just below and above the surface. Next slide. Methods. So we heard a lot about the methods, so that is really easy for me now. We combined manual chambers. I show you these chambers from my design here, and as well our newly designed within that project automatic chamber, which is a move-in chamber train and allows you with a high temporal resolution to measure all these 3 gases. And what Bärbel showed before from these overall balances is what we applied here in that project. Next slide. So now some results. Methane is as well within the paludiculture plants clearly driven by water table. And you see here an exponential curve in the background, which is close to what in our common paper, Thiemeyer et al. 2000 was then coming out from the German data set. So water table is really driving the methane emissions, and that is overall across all of these different plants in a really nice shape. Next slide. For CO2, we learned before that this is a combination of RECO, GPP, and NEE. And what you see, maybe it's a bit small, but at the end, the important part is the NEE, which is finally to that end of the cumulation. And with these cumulated numbers, then we step further in the overall greenhouse gas emission calculation for the global warming potential. Next slide, please. And that's what is coming out. So you see here clearly in such a graph that we have a water table dependency of the greenhouse gas balances. On the y-axis, you see the emissions of the or the uptake of the year balance, the greenhouse gas balance in tons CO2 equivalents per hectare and year. And on the x-axis is the water table. And what is coming out here is something like a really confirmation of our longer research without the paludicultures before, that the optimum water table from climate point of view is about -7 centimeters. We always say something about -10. So in that case, it was -7 centimeters with the optimum water table. What does that mean for the overall balance? Next slide. So this is now the comparison with the emission data which are used in the reporting for Germany, and you see that for cropland here, if you truly change from cropland to paludicultures, croplands have 40 tons greenhouse gas emissions in CO2 equivalents per hectare and year. And if you really shift then from the arable or from the cropland to a paludiculture in an optimum way, you can mitigate about 50 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare and year, carbon dioxide equivalent. That's the highest mitigation potential we ever studied and ever found out. So -13 means in that case that you really establish a sink during your measurement, so and during the management. This was really surprising for us that it is so efficient, but it has a lot to do with the specific physiology of these paludiculture plants, which pump a lot of carbon in the rhizomes and store it there and build new peat. Next slide. So, which utilization options are available? Once we say now, though, that's from the climatic point of view a good idea. But then the question is, what do the farmers do with this material? They cannot feed it really in the same way like a grassland before. Next slide. So that's what we studied in the module 3, and just very roughly the results. So from the energetic point of view, the burning it for heating purposes has limitations because of NOx emissions and slag, which is resting after the burning processes. For biogas, it is a better potential. So there is a small error in it's a good potential in reed canary grass, not in cattle. So if you use 20% reed canary grass and 80% maize in your reactor, there is no reduction in comparison to 100% maize usage in the gas reactor. So that was really surprising in a positive way. That from our point of view, the energetic use should be just the second option. The first option should be the material use. And there's a big potential of diverse upcoming market solutions. There are many companies testing successfully for construction, for insulation, for wrapper, for biochar, and so on. And in the next slide, there's just something like an exposition of different material. Next slide, please. So that is something of test materials which are at the moment underway. And so our impression is that innovative companies are really going for that at the moment, and they just replace wood fibers with the paludiculture fibers and create then new products with really good properties. And you can enter in these different categories of insulation, of biochar, of even plates and construction material. And so at the moment, we see a big dynamic in that market. And these companies are really interested to step in. I think in the next 1 or 2 years, we can really see that we have a lot of different options and offer them as well something like a complete value chain for the farmers. Next slide. What is the economic efficiency? We were at the value chains already. So next slide, please. A lot will depend on how the paludicultures are classified at the end. So what is their status and what is the way how how to orient the EU subsidies on that specific plans. On the other hand, local programs like the Peatland Farmers Program in Bavaria within these are German words now, Kulab and Moorbauern program, sorry, but that's the terms, are underway. And for next year, it's expected that there is a high funding for just innovative farmers who step from grassland or cropland and start with paludicultures. And really to compensate for the losses which they might have. The rates are, or the numbers are really high because the market is not completely established up to now. So for the farmers, it could be really a good idea to step in really, really fast and not waiting too long till the market is established, because these funding options at the moment with the specific Peatland Farmers Program just says, well, we don't have a market and we have to compensate completely. So once the market develops relatively fast, they are still within the program and they can earn a bit of money. Certificates could be something, so CO2 certificates could be combined as well. And the carbon farming strategy of the EU is just possible from our point of view if we use paludicultures on a bigger scale. Next slide. So what has to be studied further, and I'm coming close to the end of my talk already. From my point of view, next slide, some bullet points. So we have really to look carefully on the biodiversity. We studied as well biodiversity in the paludicultures on our test sites, but test sites are maybe a bit too small to scale completely up. There's a big debate if these paludicultures are really a positive or a negative effect on biodiversity. From our results, we see a lot of positive effects, and depends a lot on the, let's say, on the setting in the field. Peat soil restoration, so really to assess what you can, what is the positive effect on the paludicultures on restoring the hydrologic function of the peat. So we see with the degraded peats a lot of tense water management situations. So water is not infiltrating after rain, or it is cracking the soil after drought, and so on. And with these rhizomes of the paludicultures, we have the option to really crack this situation and to get in touch with the groundwater levels and hydrologically restore the peat soil again. Water management is something to study further because it's the key issue in paludiculture establishment. As well, we should widen a bit the spectrum of the species which we use. So there are a lot of species which are not studied up to now, as well with their specific conditions for products. So this should be a line which could be studied a bit more as well. But important is as well these long-term greenhouse gas balances and life cycle assessment. So because at the moment, and with the approach Bärbel showed before, we just look on the plot, but we do not include the positive climate effects of a product where the carbon is stored in and replaces maybe another product which has a lot of CO2 problems in the production process. So this should be studied a bit more further to have a fair assessment of the whole cycle. Landscape scale effects, that is something important as well to look at. So if you go to a peatland area where we really invest a lot in paludicultures, what is the effect on the classical land use? Is there intensification beneath? So is there leakage effects expected, and so on? Sustainable long-term productivity and economic sustainability. Well, one of the first steps in that direction is the NAPALU project of the FNR, where we are part of, Bärbel Thiemeyer as well. And there are some bullet points more, which I just let open for your ideas at the moment. But these are the key issues I would say we should further study. And let me finally summarize. We see that paludiculture are really a really good solution to combine climate mitigation, maintenance of the peat soil, economic viability, new products, and maybe the only really efficient solution to get to a larger scale and for fulfilling these climate mitigation goals of Germany and the EU. Next slide, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And what a nice picture to see everyone involved. And we have some claps, which is fantastic. Thank you very much for this presentation. And then, as you were talking about products, then I will advertise our next workshop a bit, because in the third workshop of this series, we will specifically talk about products made from paludiculture on the 7th of October. So if this is something you're interested in, you're very warm welcome to join us there. So thank you very much for the presentation. We will now have a little look if there are any questions specifically to these questions. I can see everyone is discussing the first presentation, which is amazing. So be assured, even if you don't have a question right now, there's always time to discuss in the chat. Yes, Leonas, you have a question, please.
Yes, I do. First of all, thank you for the very interesting presentation. You showed the emission factors from the various types of, I guess, revetted peatlands. Yes, one of them was forest. I guess it's alder forest or something. First of all, I have two questions. Do you have emission factors for drained peatlands as well? And are these data peer-reviewed in the scientific articles as well?
I think you refer to the table where I showed where we can reduce down to the paludicultures, right? So the table with a lot of different land use types. These are the official data from the German inventory. So this is peer-reviewed, TIMA 2020, if you look to the citation. And it is for the land use classes. So forests are the drained forest here, and the cropland are for sure cropped and drained as well. So the grassland is the big mass of drained grasslands and so on. So in these IPCC categories, these are the numbers which we use in Germany as the emission factors. Okay.
Yes, thank you. Because in our region in Latvia, Lithuania, this factor emission is 2.5. Which is strange.
For what?
For forest.
For forest, yeah. But if you look to the forests in your countries, though, they are much slighter drained. So that is, I think, a key issue. So I was coordinating lead author for the wetlands supplement 2014. Maybe you've used that exactly for that chapter of drained inland organic soils. And we had a lot of debate about the different, specifically the forest emission factors in the different latitudes, so mid-latitudes and northern latitudes. And Finnish data, for example, proposed a much lower emission factors for the forests. And the reason is that your forests are much slighter drained than our forests.
Thank you.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? I don't see anyone in the chat, but
No,
Wiebke?
but you can give maybe the hint, which Bärbel Kiemeyer also recommended here. She gave us the information to the peer-reviewed German methodology. And thank you very much for that, Ms. Kiemeyer. I think it's very valuable also here for the participants. And I've also followed up the chat here, but I think most of the questions already have been answered by Bärbel Kiemeyer. And but one of them here, I think maybe, oh no, that's also already answered by Bärbel Kiemeyer, which was referring to the heterotrophic CO2. Okay, but however, there's still some questions which we can discuss later on, for instance, like the financing aspect. I think it's very interesting, but I think we'll keep that later on for the discussion.
Yeah, Perfect. Then just remember, if you think of any questions, I mean, all the speakers are here to the very end, and you can, just like you did before, which works excellently. Thank you very much for taking the initiative, and for the speakers for always answering those questions. Just write the questions in the chat. And like Wiebke said, we will have plenty of time to go into a more detailed discussion in the afternoon. Or not in the afternoon, after later in this workshop. But then thank you very much, Herr Drösler, for this excellent presentation. And we will now have a little coffee break, so you can stretch your legs and grab a coffee. And we will be back at 11:15, where we will look more, like we already looked at, Finland and Lithuania, more international, away from Germany. And we will look forward to that. So see you in a bit, and enjoy your little coffee break. Thank you very much. Okay, the break is nearly over, and I hope that most of you are back and had a coffee and stretched your legs a bit. We will now enter the international part of this workshop, where we will have a presentation from Finland. So, Tanya, are you ready?
Yes.
Perfect. We can see you, we can hear you, fantastic. And I will...
Oh, there's Ted.
Yes, the cat. Oh, so sweet. I will share the presentation and we can start. So yeah, welcome back everybody. Oh, I see you are awake and you are reacting. Fantastic. Thank you very much. So next we will have a presentation by Tanja Mulluvita from the Finnish Environmental Institute, or SAIX, from Finland. So Tanja, the floor is yours. I will quickly share the presentation.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, then off you go. Thank you very much.
Yes. Yeah, I say my name once again with Finnish accent. Hi, I'm Tanja Myllyviita from Finland, and yeah, nice to be in this workshop. And I was very interested to hear the first two presentations, since my work is mainly focused on life cycle assessments and climate change impacts. I'm not like culture expert, and not like fully understand all the measurement techniques and so on. So I probably have to listen to the at least first presentation once again, and really try to understand how the measurement works. But yes, we have this kind of project called SOMPA, where we are studying how to decrease emissions from peatlands, and of course the culture is one option for that. And next slide, please. I will talk about this Finnish case study, since in Finland we have situation where we have two sources of emissions, and it's peat energy use, and it is actually producing quite a lot of emissions, about 10% of national emissions, and the target is to decrease that emission source and to do it quite fast. Well, that seems to generate emission savings, but then there is the problem that if peat is not used for energy, then there will be no peat for other uses as well, such as growing media and animal bedding. So that's going to be a problem. And then there is other big emission sources that are coming from the agricultural peatlands that are no longer in use. So we have about 30,000 hectares that only produce emissions. But when there are lots of emission sources, there is possibilities to decrease them efficiently. So one option would be to convert these agricultural peatlands into cultivation sites, and that would probably decrease emissions from the soils and would also provide raw material for animal bedding and growing media. Next slide, please. Here is the system boundary of this study. So in that case, we have this peat use system that is currently in Finland, and then there is this option of polyculture system that would possibly be the future of here in Finland, but you'll see. But we have several sources of emissions in both systems. For instance, in this peat use system, those abandoned organic croplands are not in use, so they produce a lot of emissions. But also there are emissions from peatlands that are used for peat extractions. And peat use, of course, mainly is causing a lot of emissions because it includes a lot of carbon and it decays. And of course, use of peat also requires some extraction operations and so on. And polyculture system, in that system, we convert those organic croplands into polycultural cultivation sites. And as in the previous slides, previous presentation states that those also produce emissions. And if we are not using peat anymore, those peatlands that would have been used for peat extractions are producing some emissions, or they act as carbon sinks, it depends. And when we are using paludistic crops for animal bedding and growing media, there will be some emissions when we are producing those products. But also these paludistic crops do intake some carbon, although the storage is quite short, but still some of the carbon is stored for a while. Next slide, please. And yes, peat is the raw material that is currently used for bedding and growing media material. And in energy, when you are using peat for energy, the carbon that is stored in the carbon, it is released to the atmosphere instantly. But in this case, when you are using peat for growing media or animal bedding, the process is much slower because in that case, the peat is usually used as a soil improver and it's spread on the agricultural lands, and the carbon is released much slower, not like instantly as in the energy use. And also in this peat use system, we assume that these abandoned peatlands are not used for cultivation of paludistic crops, and we assume that those emissions are actually quite high. According to IPCC, it is more than 20 tons of CO2 per hectare. And the next one. And about this polycultural system options, we selected 5 plants that could be suitable for Finnish conditions: willow, cattail, sphagnum, and reed venery grass. And we assume that in Finland by 2050, each plant would be cultivated in an area of 6,000 hectares. And well, as I said in previous slide, polyculture also generates some emissions, but that's the big question: what is the emissions of polyculture? And in this setup, we just set these as 15 tons of CO2 per hectare. And also establishment of polyculture farming site generates some emissions as well as manufacturing emissions. So these all were included. The next slide, please. Yes, well, peat has a long history to be used as growing media and animal bedding, and it has proven to be a very good material. So alternative materials should meet the requirements of the end users? Well, and so far we don't have a clear idea what is the substitution ratio. So for instance, can we just replace 1 ton of peat with 1 ton of polyculture crop? Well, since we don't have a clear idea of this yet, we just assume that it's like 1 cubic meter per 1 cubic meter. And the next one, please. And about the time horizon, well, GHG emissions in this study takes place in a very long time frame. And since the climate change is something that needs some actions right now, we wanted to somehow give weight to the emissions that takes place now or in the near future. Since if we have a way to decrease emissions after 100 years, it's not very relevant anymore. So we use this study to where the emissions are given weight based on when they happen. For instance, in 2040, the weight factor is 0.8 about. The next number, please. Yes, based on this study, we did up 2,000 simulations, and in this study, it appears that this polyculture system provides less emissions than peat use system, so it gives emission savings. And in 2050, the emission savings would be something about 229,000 tons of CO2, and this is about 0.5% of current Finnish national annual emissions. So, well, it's actually quite high, I think. Next one, please. Well, most of the emissions in this system are coming from the abandoned organic croplands. And in both scenarios, it's like the factor that defines what is the actual emissions rating. Other factors such as the peat decay is actually quite small factor in this setup. The next one, please. Yes, since if we don't consider the emissions coming from the organic croplands, in the peat use system, most of the emissions come from peat decay. But in this setup where we consider the time frame, it is not as bad as using peat for energy, since in this setup the peat emissions comes in a long time frame. So that is something that should be considered, that what are the actual emissions of peat use when not used for energy. And on the other hand, with polyculture, it is possible to increase this biogenic carbon intake. And although these products are used for maybe some months or maybe 1 year, they do store some carbon that should be included. But in this setup, since we set the emissions of polyculture quite high, it is only about 20% of emissions that are like reduced because of the biogenic carbon intake of polycrops. Next one, please. Yes, well, we are not quite ready. I noticed that there's a lot of questions and comments, and it's really hard to like focus on this one right now, but I assume they are related to sources of uncertainty in this study. So one obvious source of uncertainty is what are the emissions of polyculture and how do this in this setup we have a quite a long time frame considered, and it has been suggested that they will decrease a lot after establishment of cultivation sites. So that is not very clear to me what would be a fair assumption on the emissions of polyculture like now and after like 20 years. And the other source of uncertainty, of course, is this substitution ratio, how much peat, how much polyculture crops are needed to replace peat, since also it is possible to mix raw materials, and these mixes could be actually quite efficient. So that's not very clear to me, at least yet. And also how the use of peat versus polyculture products differ. We have not a lot of information on that. And of course, in this setup, we assumed in the peat use system, we assumed that these abandoned agricultural lands would not be altered. So those emissions were assumed to stay the same. But even if we would be using peat, we could somehow there are other ways to decrease those emissions except besides polyculture. And the next slide. Well, despite the uncertainties, it seems that the polyculture system generates GHG emission savings in several ways. And the most obvious way is that the emissions of polyculture are smaller than the emissions of abandoned organic croplands. That was the huge factor. And the second one is that we are reducing emissions caused by peat because we are replacing peat with polyculture products. And for third thing is that thanks to polyculture, we are storing some carbon in those products, although it's not really that influential, but still it generates some emission savings. And although all these parameters include really substantial sources of uncertainty, according to these simulations, or in all cases, polyculture actually seems to generate less emissions than peat use system. The next slide, please. Yeah, so conclusions and what has been learned and what more answers do we need? That, like I said, it seems that the polyculture provides quite a lot of emission savings, even if we assume that the emissions of polyculture are actually quite high. But still, if we want to really generate emission savings, is it the optimal solutions? But for instance, we assume that the emissions of polyculture are smaller than the emissions of abandoned agricultural peatlands, but there are other options to treat these areas, not only polycultures, and for instance, afforesting and restoring and so on. And it is important to know what are the emissions of these after treatment, these land treatment options, and how fast they could decrease the emissions, and when would those be like carbon sinks. And I believe that based on this study, it is really important to analyze what are the emissions of abandoned organic croplands when they are used for polyculture or other land use options as well. In this setup, this peat substitution is much less contributional factor, although of course we need some materials for those animals and growing media uses as well, but there are other options for that, not only polycultural products. And I truly appreciate all the data available on polyculture emissions, but I still believe that more would be more. It would be nice to see studies on the just established site and those that have been under cultivation for like 5 years or 10 years and so on. So that is something that would really improve our understanding. Next one, please. Oh yes, I came to the end of this presentation, and here are some of the references and yeah, I really interested to hear about the comments and maybe some good data sources I did not actually find. So looking forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Let's have a look at the comments. Some things, I think, with the slides where you mentioned all the uncertainties, I think you went into that because they were mentioned and you already said like the ratios, how can we replace, how do you measure all of these things? That was a question, but you already mentioned that in your slide that that is obviously something that has to be considered because that really depends on your results, how you measure and how you compensate and in what ratio. But we have lots of clapping of hands. Fantastic. Thank you for interacting here. But then let's have a little look.
Oh,
I think we should start with the assumptions. So there were Volkert Moll
Yes.
and also Matthias Drösler.
Yes, that was one thing that was mentioned twice, that you said, yes, about the emissions. You made the assumption that you have emissions of 15 tons of CO2 equivalent. Where do those numbers come from? Because it was asked twice. So if you could just elaborate on that.
yeah, it was from a quite recent review. Oh, it's in the reference list. The author is probably Italian, but if I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's Bianchi review. And in this review, they did end up with actually quite high emissions because of those sites were just recently established. And so that's probably the reason why they are quite high.
Yes, perfect. And just as an information for everyone, like we already said before, that all the presentations where you will also find the references will be uploaded on our website, and there you will have all the links and all the information if there's something you would be interested in. Then I will have another look. Oh, here's a question. Why do you go? No, it jumped. Why do you go from paludiculture on abandoned? Why do you not go for paludiculture on abandoned peatland sites? Rewetting and natural development maybe would be enough, and go for paludiculture on the peatlands under grassland or arable use. Was a question. So maybe you could.
Well, I don't know if I can answer that. Where is the question once again?
It's
Yeah,
by,
I mean, yeah, but well, in this setup, we just started with these abandoned agricultural peatlands. Of course, there are other lands that could be suitable for paludiculture as well. So, yeah, it's just because of system boundary of this study, probably.
okay, perfect. Then Leonas, you have.
Just a quick comment. I just read the Finnish experience of restoring cutover peatlands, abandoned ones. Somehow it's very popular to afforest them. 75% of them are turned into forest, which is also somehow it's a big debates going on currently, and something will change, I think, in the nearest future. So I have a lot of questions for Tanya, but maybe I will leave them for discussion.
Yes, perfect. Well, then I don't think there are any other questions at the moment. And thank you so much, Tanya. And I'm sure that if people have any further questions, you will answer them in the chat. And just there are also just some comments to you there. So have a little look. And if you think of any questions, dear participants, just make sure to write them in the chat. But thank you very much. And now we will move on to Leonas. You're already visible. Perfect. And you will share your presentation. So that is working. So yes, the next presentation will be by Leonas Jazius. Apologies for the pronunciation. Also, my Finnish accent was terrible, but well. From the Foundation for Peatland Restoration and Conservation from Lithuania. So Leonas, the floor is yours, and we look forward to your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for introduction. First of all, I'm the co-author with my colleagues Nerijus Zableckis and Jūratė Andžikaitė for this presentation. And I will probably have to start from the main facts that peatlands in Lithuania cover approximately 10% of territory, I should say, used to cover. Regrettably, 2/3 of them are used for agriculture, forestry, or peat cutting. That means they are drained. And drainage impact is particularly obvious in fen usage, which were mainly drained for agricultural reasons or purposes. And this leads me to the fact that agricultural use of peatlands in Lithuania is one of the major sources of greenhouse gas emissions. I should also point out that despite comparably small part of the occupied territory of peat cutting areas, this sector is responsible for comparably high part of the emissions as well. And as I told you before, 70% of the Lithuania's territory is occupied by peatlands. Peatlands are drained, and this led to the undesirable facts. So well-known facts as peat decomposition, loss of valuable habitats, greenhouse gas emissions, and last but not least, increased probability of peatland fire accidents as well. So about the conservation status of Lithuania peatlands, the total area of peatland included in protected areas is about 160,000 hectares, which makes up about 25% of all Lithuania's peatlands. And we have more than 100 peatlands which has a special protection status, which is very specific for Lithuania, entomological reserve, aimed to protect typical and unique wetland complexes. And moreover, we have 7 Ramsar sites. But despite that, conservation status of most habitats of European importance, such as active raised bogs, transitional mires, or bog woodlands, is unfavorable. We made some kind of GNS analysis in the frame of our previous Interreg project, which was aiming to improve water quality and promote polyculture and peatland revetting in the Nemunas basin, only in the Nemunas basin. And this study just revealed that even the most protected areas from Ramsar sites or strict nature reserves has obvious signs of drainage and is used not in a sustainable way. So these are the sites which has a first restoration priority. Of course, cannot make next slide. Yeah, of course, we all know why we need to restore peatlands. We have plenty of international agreements which are currently focused mostly on the climate change mitigation, but on the national scale, we have some strategies and actions plans as well. First of all, National Energy and Climate Sector Action Plan to implement organic soil protection as one of the measures to reach greenhouse gas emission reduction targets by 2030. Also, National Development Plan to protect and restore wetlands, and very important also the activity strategy of the State Forest Enterprise, which says to increase the area of restored damaged peatlands from 400 to 600 each year. This is very important because at least I think 40% of Lithuanians peatlands are considered has a land use category of forest. But yes, in the reality, the restoration rates in forested peatlands is not as quick as we expect them to be. Still don't see next slide. Sorry. Peatland restoration status in Lithuania. This list that I have just provided here is currently being updated. At least 10 or 12 peatlands must be added into this list, which would make 12,000 hectares totally. So compared to the rest part of the drained territory of peatlands, it is still not a big amount. And again, what is the territory of restored peatland? Take a look to the strict nature reserve or Kamanos, very beautiful raised bog, which totally occupies 4,000 hectares. But active restoration actions were implemented, for example, only in 100 territory. But this is a discussion that most probably all territory of 4,000 hectares should be included, because it positively affects the rest of the territory as well. The problem is that due to the lack of monitoring of the restoration success, it's almost impossible to assess the greenhouse gas emission reduction in these sites. And most of these territories are where nature management actions were taken are protected. This, they are protected, but they were used for forestry or industrial peat mining. Again, I cannot, yeah. This leads me to the next slide, the distribution and state or status of cutover peatlands. Although these sites are considered as low-hanging fruits, in reality, most of them are left abandoned and currently are overgrown or still gradually overgrowing by bushes of forest. From 20,000 hectares which have been inventoried of cutover peatlands, 12,000 are considered as a forest land, the forest land category land use. So revetting is currently implemented only in cutovers, which I call them cutovers, which have any kind of protection status, because the only possible way to legally implement the nature management action is to prepare so-called nature management plan. We made some kind of analysis of this, spatial analysis of these cutover peatlands, not going into details because of lack of time. First priority, as I said to you, the restoration or nature management in the protected areas and the areas which are not protected but have habitats of European importance inventoried. Later on, restoration, we propose to implement restoration or nature management action in the areas which don't have a protection status or neither habitats of European importance, but the areas which are not suitable for agriculture or forestry, that would be mostly raised bogs. And we propose to implement polyculture in the areas which has the land use category of agriculture or is mainly occupied by fen peat. So we have at least 24 cut over peatlands in Lithuania, and the rest is either spontaneous regeneration or restored peatlands already. So why I was talking about this cut over peatlands so much, we still cannot manage to make a next slide. Just a second. Why I was talking about cut over peatlands so much, we have personal experience in restoring them because we implemented a live project of called Peat Restore, which was focused mainly on reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from peatlands. So we have chosen severely damaged peatlands which were drained during the industrial peat mining processes. One of these peatlands has a very strange name, Sahara, We have constructed more than 100 dams here, cleared the woody vegetation in 30 hectares, and the results are rather promising. We increased the water level at least by 30 centimeters in all measurement points. Another site is Puszcza. The measures are almost the same, except that we included the breaking of all the drainage system, all the drainage pipes, which were during the Soviet times made from asbestos or clay. So these are the measures that we implemented, and before that it was just a bare pit. Currently the site is not only hopefully saving the CO2 emissions, but also very good habitats for protected species like red-billed toad and black grouse as well. And just not going into details for this project, we used both methods, direct measurements and guessed approach, which was delivered by Greifswald Meyer Center, but not going into details because of lack of time. From 1 hectare of restored cutover peatlands, we can save up to 14 tons of CO2 equivalents a year. Our results show that. Again, guessed approach is based on the baseline and hypothetical scenarios where you are mapping this vegetation units. About the polyculture in Lithuania, also we have implemented the project for polyculture feasibility in Baltics in 3 Baltic countries. One of the project tasks was also to prepare the GIS analysis for polyculture implementation possibilities. And we have distinguished 4 categories. Areas not suitable for polyculture, conditionally suitable areas after consideration, and fully suitable areas without restrictions. Not going into details, this 4th or green category is mainly dominated by agricultural land use, and totally covering more than 200,000 hectares, or 78% of all Lithuanian peatlands. And also, besides the agricultural lands, which are drained and not protected because we are not promoting the polyculture activities in protected areas. We included cutover peatlands which do not have habitats or protection status or not included in forest cadastre. Also, analysis has shown that most of these 4th category peatlands are dominated by fen peatland deposits. However, in reality, polyculture in Lithuania only takes first steps because there are too many uncertainties how to revert melioration system based on the national legal acts, and moreover, we are lacking payment schemes for the farmers and landowners. But one of the positive examples is Baisogala peatland, which was severely drained and used as a arable land in the past. It is located in the center of Lithuania, completely surrounded by agricultural fields. So it has a nutrient loads reduction perspective as well. At first, we did not succeed because we made it, the dam was regulated, we made the regulatory dam to make it accessible with machinery for mowing. But first of all, since the area is owned by a scientific institution, Institute of Animal Science, and these owners were willing to make the experiment and contribute to climate change mitigation. But as I told you, first year was not very successful because the water level was dropped too drastically. And currently, as we learned our lessons, we see that we have very promising results, and reed cannery grass are grown currently here. And this Institute of Animal Science are making the special researches even of grass volume and stuff like that. Almost the same example is in Liepakoj, in the neighborhood of strict nature reserve of Žuvintos. This is another example of the maintenance of bed meadows. The local farmer mows the area. The site is revetted, but the same as in the Baisogalą is a possibility to lower water level during the mowing season to make it accessible. And this hay is used for the cattle. Also, we have in the frames of the project that I told you before, like peat restore, kind of experiment for sphagnum farming. This was done by the cooperating with a peat mining company, a German peat mining company, Glassman Diamond. We have established experimental sphagnum growing pilot sites in abundant part of the peat mining fields, but it was followed by the Canadian approach. Not going into details, we just collected the material from the peat mining party, which is designated for further peat cutting. Later on, we spread it. We used mechanical spreaders as well and manual working camps. And later, based on the Canadian approach, we covered everything with the straw. Regrettably, we have made some mistakes, and the area is not the best because it is completely surrounded by drainage ditches as well. We have a reservoir, we have solar electric panels to pump the water, but for 2 hectares, it's still not enough water. And then currently, the decision is made to make the area a little bit smaller to ensure the favorable water level. The same experiment was done in the abandoned part of the Žirelis class cutover peatland, also Glassman Diamond area, but this time although experiment did not have any technical plans and water pumping systems, the results are rather promising because it is, in this case, water supplies are ensured by the water plant in the neighborhood. It's a self-supplied system. We don't need any electricity. And currently the results are even better. So I'm just finalizing now. Restoring peatlands or implementing the nature management actions, not only implementing the projects, but based on the private funds as well. One of these restored peatlands is Baisogalą, as I described you before. And, for these actions, we are cooperating also with Sukom Foundation from Germany and Greifswald Maya Center as well. I think what I have described here is our personal experience because we used to work in other institutions, but there are a couple of NGOs and protected area state services that are taking care of peatland protection. So this is just my presentation was mainly focused on our personal experience. So if you have any questions, please ask.
Thank you very much, Leonas. Can you stop sharing? Then we can see you bigger. Yes, nice. Clapping of hands. Okay. Well, thank you very much for this presentation and to show all the developments and actions you have been taking in Lithuania, which is always very, very interesting to see what other countries in Europe are doing. So thank you very much for that. I see there is one question. When did you start the sphagnum farms in Lithuania, and what is the size of the fields?
Thanks for the question. The first trials were made in 2013 and they were a complete failure. And later on in the frames of the project, as I told you, in cooperation with peat mining company, it was done in 2019. Currently the area is 2 hectares size, but it will be a little bit reduced. And the rest, the other part is in Ežerėlis is about one hectare. It's not only sphagnum, but reeds, cotton grass as well, different approaches, just voluntarily done with cooperation with us as an NGO. As an alternative for the cultivation of abandoned or cut over peatlands.
Thank you. If you have any other question, please write them in the chat. You're very kind here. Always very polite. We have very polite participants, which is excellent. But yes, if there are no other questions, or Vika, do you have a question?
No, and I think we can actually start then with the discussion, I would suggest.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Leonas, for your presentation. And then I would kindly ask all the other participants, speakers to turn on your camera so that we can see all of you. And then we will enter our discussion. Perfect. Everyone is here. And a cat, which makes it even more pleasant. Oh no, she was kicked away. Okay.
Okay, also thank you very much from my side for your very informative and very nice presentations. And we have heard a lot about the technical things, the methods, and not only on national level, but also on European level. And you can, of course, continue with putting your questions into the chat to those who are participating here and still with us, which is very nice to see. We are quite numerous today. And so please just put your questions into the chat. And maybe one first question from my side. So I think Bärbel Thiemeier already mentioned there's a nice potpourri of methods which are already available, and also Professor Drösler very nicely introduced them to us. And I was wondering if you're on the national level, it's already quite challenging comparing the data. So what do you think is really, what do we need to be able to get such a very nice data set which allows us to compare the data not only on regional level, but also national and maybe also European level?
Well, maybe I can start with a comment. Matthias will probably add his view. It depends a bit on the method you use. If you go for the eddy covariance, there's lots of standardization out there. There's also the ICOS system, which is an European level Earth observation system, where we also have some peatland sites with it. So this is far advanced, and it would be relatively easy to compare data. Here, the challenge is more the explanatory variables to get them right than the measurements themselves. For the chamber data, it's much more tricky because there are many traditions around, and to get this data comparable, to agree on standards, which has been done in Germany, more or less, to agree on standards, but to do this on an international level would require require much more efforts, and also it's always difficult to change your methods because then you don't have consistency in your own time series anymore. So a chamber is much more challenging, but probably Matthias would like to add something.
Yes, I fully agree with what Bärbel said. I think with a long history in Germany where we tried not just to standardize the chamber technique, but as well the processing of the data, we are quite comfortable, I would say. Yeah, and the question is on the European level. But the point is as well how exact or how narrow we should come to the, let's say, reality or the truth. Yeah. And what we need is really something solid to compare between different land uses once you start from cropland and change the water table. And if you really somehow account for uncertainty, which is based as well on your measurements, and then you are maybe a bit conservative with the expected uptakes or mitigation things, then you still have the right direction. And but I would really like to push a process to harmonize European-wide measurements and processing. So I said before already that I was the coordinating lead author for this IPCC wetland supplement, and we had a hard job to pull all these data together and somehow to qualify them as well for consistency. And so if we can make a step further in that direction for the procedures and really to compare as well different approaches in different countries, it would be a benefit. On the other hand, if we just look to the measurements as such, I think we just overlook the scales, and that end, I would say we have much more to optimize. So to get with these ancillary data for modeling processes in a solid way for higher scales. So you cannot do it just with emission factor times area. You should enter in modeling processes to be a bit more consistent in that. So this is, I think, the future, to be there, to look at the consistency of scaling processes. So we should do both, harmonize the measurement and the calculation procedures, but as well think a lot about scaling processes.
Yeah, thank you very much. And how about your opinions on that, Tanya and Leonas? So maybe Tanya first.
Well, I'm not an expert on those eddies and what was the name of the other machine, but yeah, I believe for me the chambers, yes. For me, the problem has been that there are quite a lot of studies on on these measurements, and it is very difficult to interpret the results. How do they generate the emissions of tons of CO2 per hectare, because there are only some measurements, and it's like in many cases I'm like, is it okay to use it, or what's involved? And other thing is that, well, it seems like half of the studies at least are from Germany. And well, one bad thing is that in some cases they are written in German and not even like English abstract or something. So that is quite a challenge. But yeah, I think for me that increasing the like transparency of those data sets would be highly helpful.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very important factor, I would say. And Leonas, how about you?
The same as Tanya, I'm not the right person to answer or comment because I'm not qualified enough. For me and for us, it's very important to make these emission factors to make the methodology of inventory as good as possible, as clear as possible. Still discussion, a lot of projects going on upscaling these approaches using the remote sensing, for example, because the graphs, for example, that I have shown for Lithuania emission balances, this is something that we did. If you would compare it to the national reports, the results would be smaller and not representing the real situation, because what we consider Peatland or Myra not always consider it in the national legal acts as well. So we have other problems. And again, how to, for example, how to upscale the guest approach, for example. There's a couple of projects and articles, but there's not too much scientific knowledge about it.
Yeah, also thank you for that comment. By saying so, there are two new comments here in the chat. One from Kamil Sardar, who's addressing Bärbel Thiemeyer and Matthias Drösler and asking to please share some methods from your team or any other which you found to standardize manual chamber methods. And by asking so, I'm not sure if it's possible, Lena, if we can also share those references which have been mentioned here already also on the website later on.
Yes, all the presentations will be available, and there you will
And
find
also the comments here, or?
No, the comments will not be published, but if there's any document, I will save it because there are lots of valuable resources shared. I will just send it in the email where you will be informed about everything. So you will get the information, but it will not be on the website, but I will send it to you via email.
Yeah, excellent. So, and another question from Susanne Warnecke from IPS. While there's a need for standardization, we must keep in mind that these are living ecosystems and emissions might be different in different regions, climate even sites, and places in one peatland. Yeah, totally correct. Yeah, Matthias Drösler, please.
Yeah, I think to the first question, Kamil Sander, maybe we send through to you, to the FNR, some papers afterwards, and you can share them this. I think that would be a way. To Susanne Warnecke, well, that's clear, so that we have individual situations, but we stratify them. So with all our measurements, we really go through a stratification process, which means first the big groups of fens and bogs, then climate regions. So in the IPCC, that was separated in climate region, then in fens and bogs, then in deeply and shallow drain, then in the land use type. So, and then we grouped then the emission factors which are available. On the other hand, the really overwhelming driving force for all emission calculations is the water table. And then there are a lot other things which you can then make the result of your model much better, but it applies within the system that you have a response function to the water table. And if you know something about the water table, and if you know your response function individually for your land use type on a specific p-type, then you can start to model. And that is what we do at the moment. So we really derive individual water table emission functions for every land use type for these on these different peatland systems. So I warn a bit that we are too shy to extrapolate just because we have individual ecosystems. So we have driving forces which are overwhelming, and these we can use for scaling up. And for example, for Lithuania, if the guest approach is not really working, it's maybe because guest was not calibrated in your area, and much better would it be to really calibrate it directly by the water table measurements and derive then these individual transfer functions. So that would be my answer to that.
Yeah, maybe I could add a little bit to this. Of course, things are different in different regions, and with all ecosystems and soils, we have to deal with the issue of spatial and temporal variability. But I think it's not an argument against standardization, but for standardization, because we need to know whether differences are because of different methods or different systems. There's a large history of discussion on chamber versus eddy covariance data, and this is ongoing, and things like this needs to be resolved before saying anything whether some mitigation methods works or does not work.
Yeah, thank you to both again, to Matthias Rüssel and also Bärbel Thielmeier. And I also agree. I mean, just like you are not starting from zero, you already have great experiences and just for decades already. So it's not a black box anymore, but it's still, from my point of view, it sounds still very challenging, but doable. Yeah. Okay, so any further questions? Then maybe
Quickly
also
on
from the
the comment.
participants.
Just
Yes.
a quick reaction. Guest approach in Lithuania is working, but it's only not used in the for the national inventors of greenhouse gas emission. And I'm just telling that maybe it should be upscaled using the innovatory new methods such as remote sensing.
Yeah, thank you also for that comment, Leonas. But as I said, so already Bärbel Thielmeier shared some another reference here for standardization. And as Lena already said, we'll maybe compile those references and make them available to everyone on one or another channel. We'll figure that out. Okay, and what I also saw actually in one of your presentations, and that was in Leona's presentations, you mentioned actually in italics, community and society. And I can remember, maybe Bärbel Thielmeier, you can also recall that situation. I think it was on one of those workshops, maybe in Oldenburg or somewhere, where one of the farmers, or could be also Osnabrück, I cannot remember exactly, where a farmer stood up and said, okay, so these are all nice numbers, what's telling me that? So because it's on one hand the scientific side, but on the other hand, we have the farmers where we need to reach to. And how do we explain to them, and how can we address them, and how can we join forces here? Because these are the people which we need to convince to maybe change the land use. And I think this is also very challenging. Bärbel Thielmeier, maybe first.
Yes, thank you. I know such kinds of situations, and they're rather tricky because many farmers know that there's a problem with peatland use, and they believe that the measurements are correct. There are also others, but assuming you have farmers who want to change things, then it becomes complicated because we are scientists, not politicians. We do scientific policy advice, of course, but it comes down to funding, be it private or be it by the agricultural funding system, and to the right policies, that there are really incentives to change land use towards wetter land use. And in my opinion, it's not that much that farmers have to be convinced. If there was a market, there's also, of course, this old hen and egg problem. Will there be markets for paludi biomass first, or will there paludi biomass first? So it might be also that there needs to be a guarantee to from the state side to use paludi biomass. So it's more about, from my opinion, more about politics and also private finance than about actually convincing farmers. Of course, not all of them are convinced, but if others see that farmers can make money with paludiculture, that would be a better argument than anything I could deliver.
Any other comments?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I
Sorry.
think the comment is also from Andreas Haberl, which is also a good friend and colleague of mine. Yeah, so this Beisogala site that we visited, and some of the German colleagues from other projects have been visiting, officials from the Ministry of the Environment and from the Agricultural Ministry also see it as a positive pilot example, and they see that it's possible and see possibility to upscale it because there's a there's a plan to restore up to 8,000 hectares of peatlands and agricultural lands in Lithuania, but in reality, as I said, there's not too much done yet.
Yes, and I think also Professor Drösler wanted to add something.
Yes, from our perspective, with with a lot of contact to farmers, we should really differentiate between something like loudspeaker things of an association of farmers, and the direct contact with those who work on peatlands. And those who work on peatlands, they know about the problem, and they know as well that the soil is going away. Yeah, and we have in our big Klimobile project at the moment a map with the subsidence, and this subsidence map shows as well how long can you continue with your ongoing land use, and there are reasonable amounts of more than 30% which could go out of the management within the next 30 years, just because the subsidence and then comes closer to the water table and comes closer to a soil below the peat where you cannot continue your classical land use. And this is really alarming, and the farmers know that, and they ask us for solutions. And they don't ask about how many tons of greenhouse gases they emit. They ask for solutions for maintaining their land use on that site. And once we come up with the paludiculture study now from the Moyuse project, the people are really interested in it and say, okay, so we step in if you guarantee long-term economical stability and assistance and knowledge transfer and all these things. And we are on that way at the moment, I would say. And what we need from these pilot studies is a bit more to scale up. I don't see that the farmers are the big obstacle. At the moment, my interpretation is that the water authorities are a bigger obstacle. So to get the rights for rewetting and to get that fast. So this is maybe something that we should target a bit more than to the farmers and convincing them. They are convinced once we have an alternative which is long-term economically viable.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think I can also remember just a very recent discussion, especially on that permission issue. I think it also varies a lot, not only in Germany, but I can also think that it's also the same problem, so to say, or the same challenge also in Finland and elsewhere in Europe. And I think this is also a very important thing which we need to consider, that also authorities play a key role here. And it's very important I think, to shorten those permission ways, and just to say, okay, we also need to get more efficient here. Yeah, that we have not that long permission we need to really put down, well, document A to C, and once we get those documents, they say, well, it's out of date, we need to deliver more recent data and so on, and we are turning circles, so it's leading nowhere, I would say. So it's also very important. So we have just another comment here from Niels Garde to everyone. It seems that we have good data on greenhouse gas emission of drained peatlands and restored peatlands, but less so on the different types of paludiculture. Not yet, I would say. I would like to add here, the case for rewetting peatlands is very strong, but what type of paludiculture is coming at what cost in terms of greenhouse gas and soil conservation could be still open for discussion. If this is correct, shall we push for rewetting while still waiting for more data before we prompt large-scale paludiculture, at least for fence? Head shaking already. Maybe Bill Timai first.
Yeah, head shaking immediately. I don't think we have the time to wait. And also paludiculture for fence is depends on what you do. I mean, Typha and also Phragmitis are very detailed managed systems, while wet grassland systems are not that far from what we do in restoration anyway. So there's more the question on the biomass side, where product chains need to be developed. Typha and so on is a bit more complicated. But in all cases, we need to do something about the water management. Independently of if it's restoration or paludiculture, this takes time, and we need also lots of developments in terms of agricultural production in paludiculture, be it machinery, be it best management, be it all the issues with combining paludiculture and biodiversity and so on. So there's lots of questions scientists, not only from the greenhouse gas sides, but also from agronomy need to work on, and this needs to start like now. We can't wait until we have multi-years of greenhouse gas measurement data.
Yes, fully agree. We cannot wait and we should not wait. But I would say if there is the impression that we have too few data to say something, that's wrong. We have already some good, really good data and new data on the paludicultures, both in southern Germany as in northern Germany. And the direction is in both cases the right direction. So rewetting and establishing paludiculture as a productive land use has an enormous contribution to climate mitigation. And so we were surprised with our high uptake rates, and then Bärbel and her team had new publications or new results and come to similar values. So that was let's say something like a proof that it is not just a single spot situation, which we measured here in 3 different peatland areas in southern Germany. So it is enough to say that that's a good solution, but we should really continue as well to measure for the longer term effects and for including new crops and these things in the paludicultures, but don't hesitate to use them as a climate mitigation measure.
Yeah, thank you. I think that was a very clear statement, and I think, are there any further questions here in the chat which are still open? Yes, so also thank you very much and very reassuring. Yes, for sure. Okay, I think any questions from our side? I think there are no left. Are there any questions from your side? Also asking you as the presenters.
Any question you want to discuss?
Any comments which you would like to communicate here to the people?
I just want to communicate that I think this format is great, which you developed from the FNR, and that it makes fun to exchange on an international level. On the other hand, I see that we have different, let's say, states of knowledge or positions and identified knowledge gaps. And my wish would be that we, in an international approach, really screen all the ongoing measurements, modeling processes, European-wide, and see if we come a bit closer to something like harmonized approaches and estimates. So all the countries have to report. Bevel does a lot and a good job in a solid reporting for the greenhouse gas emissions from the organic soils. The other countries should do that as well, or do that as well already. But we still have to assess these changes between land use once you make it wet and change the crop, or come from cropland to paludiculture. And these changes, these dynamic systems, these are not completely integrated in inventories, but this is something where you could look a bit further with modeling processes. And for that reason, I really am motivated to look on a European scale on these options. So the Green Deal just works if we use all the potentials which we have. And in the carbon farming strategy, peatlands and paludiculture is one topic. So it's up to us from the scientific side to be as solid as possible with some estimates, and these estimates can just be based on good measurements and good models.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Drösler, and also maybe from Tanya or Leonas. Now would be your opportunity for that.
Well, questions from me. Well, during this session, when you talked about the farmers and maybe said that those farmers are not even the problem, but and I don't know if it's just me who's worried, but those farmers have a huge role on these emission mitigation, since, as some of you said, and maybe almost everyone knows, that the water table level has huge impact on emissions. So if, for instance, we somehow manage to get the farmers start cultivating cultivation sites, that's not enough. We should somehow make sure that they ensure that the water table level is optimal, because I assume that the growth rate of these crops are not that different depending on the water table level, but the emissions do change a lot. So I don't know, that was maybe my question. Are you worried about the farmers, that they are not like reliable enough to control the emissions?
Yeah, we already got an agreement from Susan Barnicke from the International Peatland Society here too. And Leonas, any comment or question, final one?
Yeah, actually, a lot of questions for Tanya, because I'm recently preparing a study for cutover peatlands, or wise use of cutover peatlands. But I think we should just, we will contact later if we can. But what is related to maybe to the subject of our seminar, afforestation and versus rewetting of peatlands. A lot of discussion. Then we have the latest scientific paper written by the most famous peatland researchers currently. It's very well written, but in that article I still missing the scientific, in emission factors in that area to prove that peatland rewetting is not only good for the conservation status, but for climate mitigation region as well, compared to promoting the afforestation and growing trees. Because currently, as the foresters claims, timber sequestrates way much more, at least in Lithuania, more carbon compared to the some drained peatlands. This is reality.
Thank you. So I think not only here, but also elsewhere, we could state then and conclude further research is needed, which is just a common sense here. Okay, so from my side, there's just the last comment. I just need to read that back to agriculture payments. Okay, this goes to Tanya. This depends on what you bind to agricultural support payments. For carbon farming, if you set an obligatory water level target that will get benefits on top to revenues from polyculture that can be controlled. So just, I think that's just the last comment from Andreas Haber in that case. And I think from my side, as I said, there are no further questions. And great to see that we are doing a good networking work here, obviously. And it was really nice to see that everyone was participating really nicely here in the chat with comments. And also thank you from my side at that stage here to all our presenters today and for participating in this discussion. Thank you very much from my side.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Wiebke, for leading this discussion, and we see lots of clapping of hands. Well, then, my role is basically just to... Oh, that's very nice. Even some claps and very good. And then from my side, to close this workshop, I just want to point out a few things. So like I said before, the presentations that you have seen today will be uploaded on our event website. This is the website where you also registered. And there you will also, this will take a bit longer, you will also find the recording of this event. So this is something that you can get back to, and the presentations will be available there. And since you were very effective of sharing knowledge and reports and whatnot, a lot of information in the chat, I will make sure to save the chat and then pick out all the relevant references and add it to an email, which I will send to you, where you will be informed about when the presentations are online and so forth. So everything will be there. There's no need to worry that anything will be lost. So just be reassured about that. And then I would also lastly like to take the opportunity to advertise our third workshop, which is the final workshop in this workshop series, which will take place on the 17th of October, same format as now, also same time, where we will go into the different products that can be made from paludiculture, which will be very interesting. So also some case studies in a sense. So I hope to see most of you there as well. And then I would like to thank all the speakers today for, first of all, participating and for really dedicating your time and efforts here. And from an administrative side, it was very easy to work with you, which I always highly appreciate. So thank you very much for that. And thank you, dear participants, for joining us today and for staying with us, even though it's nearly lunchtime. So thank you very much for that. And really, it was really great to see that so many of you joined us today and that you were very active and you were really making good use of the chat. So that's it from me. I wish you a lovely afternoon and I hope to see you on the 17th of October. Take care and goodbye.